The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Geraud, and as always, I'm joined by CGSP's Africa editor, Geraud, from the beautiful island of Mauritius. A very good afternoon to you, Geraud.
Good afternoon. Bonjour, Eric.
It was almost 3 years to the day. I mean, go back to November 2020, Geraud. Can you remember November 2020? I mean, that was before all of the chaos that we've gone through with the pandemic and all the various things that have happened since November 2020. But in November 2020, that was when Zambia defaulted on a $42.5 million interest payment for Eurobonds, making Zambia the first African country in the pandemic era to default on its debt. Nobody knew back in November 2020 that we would be here in November 2023 and still not have any debt resolution. The Zambians were taken on this odyssey through various multilateral discussions that then ended up in the G20 with something called the Common Framework that we're going to discuss a little bit more. Lots of hope and excitement that the Common Framework was going to be the solution to it. That apparently has not materialized. Then in June of this year, all of the key players got together in Paris and announced what many people had called a landmark deal. And there was a lot of optimism that after 3 years of haggling, of going back and forth among the Chinese, among the IMF, bondholders, all the different stakeholders, that a deal had finally come to pass. We then find out a week from last Monday that everything blew up. Zambia suffered a major setback in its debt restructuring efforts after the government said a deal to restructure $3 billion of Eurobonds could not be done due to objections from bilateral creditors. Those are the sovereign creditors, states, countries. In specifically, China and France said no. The main issue here is whether the deal that was on the table with those bondholders is comparable to what was on offer for bilateral creditors, and the bilateral creditors said it wasn't. Let me just kind of lay out the numbers here so we know what we're talking about. Zambia's total public debt, the latest numbers that I have is probably from earlier this year. The numbers probably have changed quite a bit, and we might get some clarity on that in our discussion, are at around $32.8 billion. Around half of that, some $15 billion, is owed to external creditors. And the reason why China is important here is because they are the largest of the bilateral creditors, with about $6.3 billion. As many of you know who've been listening to our show for some time, we've talked about this a lot. We've done a lot of coverage on the website. And Deborah Braudegam over at the China Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins University did some amazing research last year and the year before, where she outlined the number of creditors on the Chinese side. So a lot of people think it's just the China Exim Bank. Turned out there were, at one point, up to 18 different Chinese creditors, some private, some semi-private, and some state-owned enterprises. But again, 4.1 billion of that goes specifically to the China Exim Bank alone. So the bulk of it is going to one of the key policy banks. Geraud, it's a very complex landscape. The Chinese are one player, but they're only one of many different actors in this drama.
Yes, definitely, Eric, because Zambia is a very, very complex situation when you have a multitude of lenders that just take part in this whole process. The Chinese has the tendency to stick out in this situation because in this case specifically, they are one of the main bilateral actors in the Zambia crisis. But they are not the only one, though. As you mentioned before, you have multilateral creditors where you find the IMF, the World Bank, and you also have the Paris Club members and the non-Paris Club members, and you have the the Eurobond holders, the commercial creditors. You have a very complex and various landscape of players in this situation that just makes the debt restructuring and discussion around Zambia's situation much more complex. That's not surprising that it took us 3 years since November 2020 up till now. We thought that we had found an agreement in June and later on in Marrakesh in October, but last week apparently everything just fell flat and we are back to, I won't say we're back to square one, because when you hear Zambia finance minister and Paris Club members, they're saying, you don't need to worry about that. It's just a minor setback. We're going to go back to normal. There's no need to worry. But when you look how the market is reacting to the whole Zambia situation, you kind of feel that, it's still quite a difficult situation that Zambia is going through right now. And we wonder what kind of compromise they're going to find, because before the bilateral creditors, renegate, I won't say renegated, they kind of pull back from the agreement they found with Zambia in late October this year. The IMF and China kind of had that reservation toward the discussion that Zambia was having with its private bond creditors. They were kind of not happy about the principle and how things were going up there. So we kind of thought that we're going to move forward, especially when the IMF, according to different reports, the IMF kind of accepted a tweaked agreement they signed with the bondholders. We thought that it's going to pave the way for the official creditors to be on board with that, but no, they were just not happy about the condition and we went back to square one. I remember last October China was saying that Zambia's creditor needs to shoulder a fair burden in the country debt restructuring. So since then apparently things just went sideways since then. So here we are in that stalemate where Zambia is just stuck in the middle of this whole international finance restructuring process that we developing country needs to go through right now.
Now, last week when we touched on this issue, we all acknowledged that this is too complicated for us who are not experts in this and don't follow this on a regular basis. And we said we would bring an expert on to help us figure this out. And we are just thrilled to have on the show for the first time Rachel Savage, who is Africa Senior Markets Correspondent at Reuters, where she covers finance and economics across sub-Saharan Africa. She has been following the Zambia debt story for a long time. Really, she's one of the lead correspondents on it out there in the press. And Rachel joins us today from the UK. So thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule, Rachel. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, Eric and Geraud. I'm thrilled to be joining you guys. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, it's fantastic because we really need your help to better understand what happened here. Let's start with where are we right now? It's been almost 2 weeks now since the June deal blew up a week and a half ago between the official creditors and the bilaterals. Where are we now? Is there anything new since that happened?
We haven't heard anything new since the official creditors co-chaired in a committee by China and France since they rejected the revised second bondholder deal. So we haven't heard anything publicly yet. There's sort of radio silence on that front, effectively. But just one point of clarification. So that June deal that the official bilateral creditors reached that you mentioned, they reached a memorandum of understanding in October at the IMF meetings, but each country still needed to sign individual agreements, which haven't been announced yet. So it's not going back on any.
Did that happen from June till now? Did they sign those agreements? Did they get the sign off?
So they agreed on a memorandum of understanding in October at the IMF and World Bank annual meetings. But as far as we know, or at least it wasn't announced that each individual country signed the MOUs, because each individual country has loans with Zambia, so they needed to sign individual agreements. So that hadn't happened yet as far as we know it.
So basically, we're in the process where each of those official bilateral creditors they're about to sign this MOU, and then Zambia went moving forward in its discussion with the bondholders. So basically, since now this bondholders agreement kind of, I wouldn't say blew up, but official creditors are not happy about that. Is it fair to say that are we going to see now those countries sign this MOU that they agreed upon on Marrakesh in late October?
Not yet, because they want the bondholders to give more. The bondholders are saying, no, we won't give more. The second deal we reached was signed off by the IMF, so that's it, we're done, we're not offering any more. So I don't think they're going to move forward with signing the individual country agreements until the bondholder side of things is sorted out. So Right now, at least what we know publicly is we're at an impasse, basically, where bondholders are saying we won't give more and the official creditors are saying, well, you need to give, we're not budging on this.
Can you walk us a bit back in the Zambia story situation? In this current situation, what's the main disagreement between the official creditors on one side and the bondholders? What's they're not agreed upon? Because from people who are listening to us, they would think that Zambia would negotiate with the both of them at the same time. But apparently, you have two different set of creditors, and now they kind of disagree on the term of the agreement they got. What's really differentiated the both of them, and what's the cause of disagreement right now?
Yes, so you're right that there's two separate negotiation processes that had been going on, although, advisors for each side were meant to be sort of talking to each other. So you had the official creditors in their official creditor committee talking to the Zambians, and you had a group of bondholders who between them held enough of each bond to form what's called a blocking stake. So basically they held control of the bonds via their stakes, and they formed a committee. And they were also negotiating with the Zambian government. Now, the official creditors, the way the common framework works is the official creditors have to reach an agreement first, which the bondholders don't like very much, but we can come back to that. But the official creditors have to sort of strike a deal first. And then the deals with other types of creditors, including bondholders, but also you've got some private Chinese banks in there, some private Western banks. Those deals are not supposed to be better than the one the official creditors get. You're supposed to have something called comparability of treatment. Now, the issue is that comparability of treatment hasn't really been properly defined. There isn't a formula. It works on sort of three parameters. There's the net present value haircut. So that's how much the debt pile is reduced by over the life of the debt. So, you have inflation, for example. So, the value of the money is going to go down. And then you've got any sort of reductions in interest rates, any cuts to the principal value of the debt. Now, the official creditors, they didn't offer a principal haircut. China especially does not like giving principal haircuts. What they did was they extended the maturity of the loans. They offered a grace period, so no payments for the first 3 years, 2023, this year, but 2024 and 2025 as well, so the period of the IMF program, and they offered interest rate cuts as well. Bondholders, on the other hand, they are going to be their deals, both the first and the second deals, proposed being paid quite a lot of money during the IMF program period. But they said that they also had given a haircut because the accrued interest for their bonds, they cut the value of that. But the other parameters are for comparability treatment are maturity extensions, which the official bilateral creditors, China, France, etc., offered a lot of, and the debt service relief during the program period. And they offered debt service relief during the program period, whereas bondholders said, no, we want, and the Zambians agreed to this, we want money in 2024 and 2025. So presumably the official creditors disagreed with this. They thought that this wasn't comparable. However, in the Zambian statement, when they said that the second revised bondholder deal had been rejected, they said the official creditors didn't agree on what the bondholders need to do to offer a comparable deal. So apparently the official creditors haven't even agreed on what comparability of treatment necessarily means in this case either.
Exactly. And you mentioned something, a framework, the common framework, because when I was reading your coverage of the story, I've read all those principles, the element of principles, and something really struck me is the fact that the G20 framework, I'm already mentioning, but the G20 framework was supposed kind of to allow all the creditors to be able to kind of manage all those issues and principles, to bring more transparency, to know who's getting what, how much haircut X is giving to Y and everything. But obviously, after that, we are still in that place where the common framework hasn't helped much. Can you walk us a bit to tell us what the G20 common framework was supposed to achieve in the case of the restructuring of developing countries?
So the G20 common framework was launched in November 2020, so quite soon after the COVID-19 pandemic started. And it was recognized that a lot of developing countries were struggling with their debt at this time because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But traditionally, debt had been dealt with bilaterally through the Paris Club of creditor nations, which is mainly developed countries. So you've got Western countries, you've got Japan and the like. The common framework was meant to bring in China, but also India, Turkey, Saudi Arabia to this process. And it was meant to provide a framework for low-income countries, specifically not middle-income countries, but for low-income countries that were struggling with their debts. So then early 2020, January, you had Chad sign up, and then February, you had Ethiopia and Zambia. And since then, you had Ghana sign up as well. Ghana defaulted in December 2022. But the thing is, no countries have actually been offered debt relief under this process. It's been painfully slow. So Chad made its way through the process, but it didn't actually get any debt relief, just a promise that if oil prices fell, then creditors would come back to the table and maybe offer something more, but maybe not. Zambia's process, which we're discussing now, has been stuck in the mud. Ethiopia, well, they got delayed by their civil war, but there's been a ceasefire for more than a year now in Ethiopia. So they're still going through the common framework process as well. And now Ghana is also still going through the process. But the thing is, the common framework is still, bilateral creditors still negotiate first, essentially. And some analysts might argue that this is part of the problem in Zambia, that private creditors, and in this case, the bondholders specifically, are coming later in the process.
And there was a lot of concern with the common framework from a number of countries, which is why only 3 or 4 have signed on to it, that by participating in the common framework, they could suffer a ratings hit and the cost of their credit would go up. And so a lot were very concerned that the process was actually not equitable for the borrowing country, for the debt-distressed country, which is why a lot sat on the sidelines for it. It does seem a little bit that we're in this, almost like, I like to use the example of Reservoir Dogs, which is the Quentin Tarantino movie, and everybody's got a gun at everybody else's head. And there seems to be this lack of trust among the various stakeholders, where the bondholders are convinced that the bilateral creditors, specifically the Chinese, are going to get a better deal. Early on in this process, the Chinese were suspected of maybe doing a backdoor deal with the government, and then the bondholders would have to pay. And the Chinese now are saying, that they don't like what the bondholders are getting. And then for much of last year, the Chinese were saying that they want the multilateral development banks, that's the World Bank and the IMF, to also take haircuts. And those Bretton Woods institutions said, that's not how it works. That's not what we do. And so how is it possible that with so much distrust on all sides and potentially even lack of transparency throughout the process, that they can come to some kind of agreement? But it does seem to be that trust here is a key problem.
That is certainly what some analysts would argue. But my colleague Libby George and I, we did a piece last week where we spoke to people who are more experts in this than I am, at least anyway. And some of them did make the argument that, this is just debt restructuring. Nobody trusts each other. Everybody's trying to get the best deal for themselves, whether it's the borrowing country, whether it's the bondholders, whether it's private banks, whether it's China, France, the US, the UK, whoever is lending is trying to get a good deal. Whether trust has broken down, in Zambia and how that impacts, Ghana, Ethiopia, but also Sri Lanka and Suriname, which aren't in the common framework. I think that sort of remains to be seen. But certainly, obviously, the breakdown of negotiations for Zambia, the Zambians, have said about how badly this is affecting their economy. So, something in the process has not worked. That's probably a fair argument that many are making.
In your coverage of the story, you've been talking to various experts on the matter, as you mentioned. When they look at the situation right now, what's the way forward? I mean, what's the Zambians and what's Africans, especially when I think a country like Ghana, Chad, as you mentioned, and Ethiopia, should they be worried about what may happen next, or should they be kind of hopeful on what solution can come out of this situation now?
I don't have a crystal ball. I think we'll kind of have to wait and see and then assess when we've gone a bit further down the process. It clearly doesn't look good that Zambia has been in default for more than 3 years now, that its negotiations have broken down. So other countries looking at Zambia might feel a lack of confidence in the processes. But, if they get a deal in, a few weeks' time or a month or two, however long it is, then that might bring confidence back into the process. We'll have to wait and see how things play out. But just to say again that, Sri Lanka is also going through a process like this, but without the common framework. And they also have to negotiate with bondholders, but also China by itself, and then a separate creditor committee. So some people have pointed out it may not be just the common framework that causes issues, although Sri Lanka has moved forward with its official creditors, excluding China today after reaching a deal with China. So, there might be progress in processes other than Zambians, which brings sort of confidence to other countries and other processes.
Well, the issue in Sri Lanka is very interesting because the Chinese are negotiating bilaterally with the Sri Lankans, and then on the creditor committee, they're standing in as an observer, not as a main participant. And one of the other challenges in the Sri Lanka case, and this is an interesting point in Zambia as well, is that there's a certain layer of geopolitics there because the Japanese, the Americans, and the Indians are at the table, many of China's rivals. A lot of people have inserted geopolitics into the Zambian process. There was a lot of talk coming from David Malpass, who is the former World Bank president, who was a pretty vocal critic of the Chinese in the Zambian debt process. And then the American stakeholders, from Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, to the ambassador, to any number of different people, have criticized the Chinese for their behavior throughout the Zambian debt restructuring process, saying they're taking too long, they're asking too many questions. In your coverage of this story over the past couple of years, have you seen a geopolitical angle that's come into it, or is that misreading it and putting politics in everywhere it doesn't necessarily belong?
I mean, there's definitely been a geopolitical angle because of, the interventions you mentioned. So, the complaints from American participants, but also, as you mentioned, David Malpass, the former World Bank president, and then even, the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, visited Zambia and, called for the process to move faster. But I think we have to remember that China is new to these processes. It is new to, relatively speaking, to being a creditor country where the countries that it lends to are struggling to pay back its debts. And there are a lot of actors within China. That's something, we hear quite often is the central bank. There's the Ministry of Finance. There's all the different policy and commercial banks. So in Zambia's case, you have China Exim Bank as the official bilateral creditor. But then you also have China Development Bank, you have ICBC, you have Jiangxi. So China itself, has to sort of learn what it wants to do in this process, how to navigate different actors, how it wants to deal with the countries it lends to, but also the other elements in the process. And, geopolitics, may not be escapable, as it were, but I think there are other kind of considerations as well, which is, how the Chinese kind of act together and formulate their positions given the sort of internal dynamics in China.
And Eric, you remember a few months back when you had a discussion, we keep on having this discussion, we keep on saying how China is kind of new into the game in all this context where it has to face itself internally with this huge debt that its provinces and region has to pay back to Beijing, and how it's really weighing in on how China is approaching the context of this Zambia debt. And you also even mentioned how much the debate about China asking too many questions, like much more of like a China that's kind of learning the ropes and how to move forward in this situation. And we also see that they're kind of learning because in different cases, Zambia, Ethiopia, Sri Lanka, they're kind of moving in a different direction with different behavior based on different contexts and different, maybe geopolitics that can kind of really determine how China is behaving in this whole context. Yeah, it's quite complex. Yeah.
It's a fair point, though, Geraud, because, the United States and the Paris Club lenders have decades of experience doing this, going back to the 70s and 80s, at least. And so the Chinese are relatively new to this process. It does take time. They've never had to go through this process at all. And to the point that you made about the provinces and the domestic issue, the central government in China has made it very clear that the provinces cannot declare bankruptcy. They must pay back their debts. And so the politics domestically in China on debt relief make it almost impossible, if not impossible, for them to turn around and then grant relief to African countries like Zambia. Because Chinese taxpayers would say, what are you doing? You're giving Zambia a cut and not us? So that does make the situation very complicated. And I think a lot of people in Africa don't appreciate the domestic politics that the central government in Beijing is under and the pressure that they're under for that.
And I like mentioning that because sometimes when we lose sight of that element, we tend kind of to simplify Chinese position on that issue by saying we go back into the debt trap narrative that we've been debunking for years. But yes, we tend to go back to those simplistic narrative that kind of hide the complexity of China's approach in this situation.
Yeah. So, Rachel, let's wrap up our discussion with what do you expect next? I know you don't have a crystal ball, but as you talk to your sources and in your coverage, is there any events planned that would help break this logjam? What should we expect and look for in the coming weeks?
So we don't really have anything in the diary. I mean, there's the IMF World Bank spring meetings in April 2024, but, the Zambians would hope very, very much that things will be resolved before then. But we don't really have anything in the diary per se, so we're sort of watching and waiting and talking to people for now.
Well, that is not very encouraging because meantime, Zambia is suffering. Interest rates went up last week. The value of the kwacha has fallen on this news, and the burdens for the Zambian consumer were already difficult, have gotten even more painful as a result of this collapse of these debt talks. For President Hakainde Hichilema, he came to office saying he was going to fix this. And so the longer this goes, the more it erodes his credibility on this issue. His term is still long way to go, but time is running out for him to fix this before he has to run for re-election. Rachel, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Rachel Savage is Africa Senior Markets Correspondent at Reuters. By the way, everybody, I just cannot recommend this enough. I've got an alert on X for Rachel's posts, and I think you should do the same. She breaks news on X. If people want to find you over on that social media network now known as X, where can they find you?
My handle is Rachel M. Savage. I've been posting a little bit less recently on X, but this is perhaps a reminder to me that I should do so, if only because I know that you guys are watching.
Well, you have a bunch of devoted followers at the China Global South Project, and I know others are. And I guess we're all just hungry for information on this story. And you happen to come across a lot of great scoops and insights on it in your reporting. We'll put a link to Rachel's X handle and also to a link to all of her reporting from Reuters. Rachel, thank you so much for taking the time and helping to clarify this very complex issue for us.
Thank you, Eric and Geraud. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. So thanks for having me on.
Geraud, that was the most easy to understand, clear explanation that I've gotten about the Zambia debt situation since this whole drama began 3 years ago. The problem is that I don't feel very good about what's about to happen here, that there doesn't seem to be any progress in sight for Zambia. Zambia, in fact, to me, feels like collateral damage in the fight amongst the bilaterals, particularly the Chinese, the IMF, World Bank, and the bondholders. And at this point right now, Zambia just gets to suffer and life just gets worse, but there's no resolution in sight. And if they haven't fixed this in 3 years, there's nothing that indicates in the near future they're going to be able to do it. And that's, to me, the bigger concern.
Yeah, that's true. But on the other hand, I do believe that they're going to have to find a solution, no matter the type of solution, no matter who's going to lose what and how much, but they're going to have to find a solution, because I don't recall any country that's been left just, rotting its debt without ever paid.
Why do you say that? I mean, we're in a new era now, because part of this is about breaking new ground with the Chinese at the table, and they're all afraid of setting a precedent that's going to be applied to other countries. But I don't necessarily take for granted that they're going to be able to come up with a solution. And here's the big problem about Zambia. It's a lot of money we're talking about, billions of dollars. But for the financial service firms and for China, it's not that much money. So they can fight this one out for a long time. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that, to me, again, if they haven't gotten their money back in the past 3 years and they haven't figured something out, I don't know what's going to change in the next 6 months.
I do think that they're going to find a solution for one specific thing, because Zambia is now in this debate of energy transition. Zambia is a copper producer country, is a major copper producer country. So as much as the financial world might not be happy about how things are moving towards Zambia, when you took the geopolitics of natural resources in the mix, when you see the various agreements that European countries and the US want to sign with Zambia, knowing that they try to motivate and push their own private sector to invest in Zambia, I see the situation where...
Yeah, but I don't know where you're going with that. I mean, the U.S. government doesn't have any say over J.P. Morgan, or London doesn't have any say over the hedge funds. So I don't know what that means.
No, that's true. It just means that if they really want to see those companies starting to move in those directions, they're going to have a certain way to find a solution for Zambia to become a welcoming country for the financial system again. They're just not going to let Zambia rot like this, because if they do, they're also losing an opportunity to come into a market where they need to be there, they need to be present. And let's not forget that in the agreement they found with the bilateral creditors, the agreement was like, when Zambia's economy goes back, Zambia is going to pay back. They put that element right there because they know that Zambia is a natural resources producing countries. So they kind of put that in their mind. They have that in the back of their mind that, we're going to have to take that into account. That's why I do believe that as much as difficult it can be, but they're going to find an agreement. In 6 months, I don't know, but they're going to have to find an agreement.
I don't have that same confidence. I don't think they care at all about Zambia. I don't think they care if Zambia rots and the people suffer. That's not their concern. But let's go to Hakainde Hichilema, the president. And you could speak to this because we had the same issue when your president, Felix Tshisekedi, went to China. Some people praised the fact that Hakainde Hichilema, who recently went to China and met with Xi Jinping, didn't bring up the debt issue. They said, see, it's not that big of an issue. And I was flabbergasted by that. I said, there is no more important bilateral issue now between the Chinese and Zambians than resolving the debt issue. And I was surprised that in a final statement that came out of that meeting, there was no reference to the debt. There was no pressure put on the Chinese president to make something happen. As you pointed out, there is geopolitics involved in this. These resources are important to China. Chinese mining companies are in Zambia extracting copper. Cobalt also comes from those same mines in many respects. And I felt that Hakainde Hichilema had an opportunity to really make a direct appeal to the Chinese president to say, listen, get your policy banks to help us out. Get a deal done. And if you don't get a deal done, I'm going to try to start squeezing the copper. He didn't do that, though. And I don't understand that, why there was not more pressure put on Hichilema to do something on that. Instead, he was gallivanting across the country in Shenzhen and in Fujian and going to all these places and sightseeing for 6 days. And I thought, what a freaking waste of time. You have got a tanking economy and you spent 6 days in China kind of doing all of these fun, exciting things and whatever. Your people need you on the ground to fix this debt issue. The Chinese are central to this issue. Xi has authority to actually provoke, some change in that system. I don't know if he can wave a magic wand and just make it all go away, but he certainly can give some indications that he wants things to change and to speed this process up. But without pressure, Xi's a politician. He doesn't need to do anything if he gets no pressure. And Hichilema, to me, was absolutely irresponsible in not putting pressure on the Chinese president to act.
But do you remember we had that discussion a few months back? It speaks to that difficulties and I'd say that unwillingness from African countries to push hard in the narrative against China. You remember when the Financial Times ran a story about the Zambia finance minister, condemning China being the main responsible of the blockade of the negotiation. 24 hours later, they retracted it because he had to write to say, no, Zambia is not in the position of saying that China is responsible. And even when they found the agreement, still Zambia stood by China and saying China is not responsible of the situation. So it speaks to that attitude that you even see. We spoke about that, I think, in the last show when William Ruto, when he was speaking at Paris Summit, was speaking, really spitting, harsh narrative against World Bank and Macron and everything. But when it comes to speak to China, they have that kind of deference, respect. I do believe that China has imposed in certain way toward them in a way that they don't have either the strength or either the willingness to really push hard into the narrative. They don't know what to do. That's definitely they don't know how to do.
They don't know what to do. They don't know what to do because they have no China competency within their governments, okay? They don't have the people advising them. Let me give you an example, and I wrote about this today, okay? The Vietnamese are just ballers in this space, okay? So the president went up to Japan this week and met with Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. And President Chung, he signed a upgrade of diplomatic relations and as new security pact. We're talking weeks before Xi Jinping comes to Vietnam. Now, if you understand anything about Asian politics, Japan is literally China's most bitterest enemy, okay? This is a baller move. And then, okay, so back in June, Prime Minister Chin, he goes to Beijing to meet with Xi Jinping. And you know what they do? They park a U.S. aircraft carrier in the backyard in Vietnam to say, hey, listen, hey, Mr. Xi, I'm happy to be here, but look at my friends and what they brought. Okay, we've got options. We're prepared to use them. We're going to move if you don't help us. And they play this game very, very effectively. And I just wish, and I tell this all the time to African stakeholders and senior policymakers and think tank analysts and whatnot, and they never listen to me. I say, you guys should study how the Southeast Asian countries handle the great power rivalries, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, because they've been dealing with the Chinese and the Americans for decades. And in Africa, the problem is those governments, as you know, your government in Kinshasa and in Lusaka, they've got zero China competency, zero.
And mind you, the country that you're mentioning are the few countries in Africa that has real leverage towards China. There are the few countries that can say, if I put my foot on the ground, I say, my friend, I'm not going to move on it. China can feel it, can okay, I think I'm going to do something. But despite the leverage they do have, the advantage they do have, they're still not, I don't know what's happening to them. They're kind of just frozen in time. They just don't know how to move. I have the feeling that somehow I don't know, maybe I'm speculating here, as I'm surely speculating here, but I got the feeling they just know that maybe they're not that important for both China and the US or in the West to be able to play the both countries at the same time, to play the two sides on the same time.
I'm not saying they play the countries off each other. That's not what I'm saying, because I think that's a risky thing, especially if you don't know what you're doing. I am saying that Zambia should have very strong competency, should have great people who know China, who know the US, who understand about how to take advantage of the opportunities, but also know how to push them. And somebody should have advised the president that when he was in Beijing, his top priority should have been resolving this debt issue and not gallivanting around the country.
I think someone maybe told him, no need to put the debt issue on the table since we are having a negotiation with the OCC Club, the official creditor committees. So there's no need to single out China. Now, I do believe that, there's no need to single out China in this process because...
Well, look how that played out. Look how that played out.
Exactly. But if he had singled out China that time, I think that he was afraid that he wouldn't get...
He doesn't have to do it publicly. Don't get me wrong. He doesn't have to call China out publicly, but he should have made it a priority in his discussions, and it does not appear that that was the case. And so here we are, 3 years into this process, no end in sight. I think Rachel's last comment that there's nothing on the diary for this to change. We're going into the holidays now. And we are 4 weeks away, 3 weeks away from, the Christmas holiday and the New Year holiday. So big things generally don't happen this time of year. And meantime, life for regular Zambians, because of this crisis, again, has gotten worse. This is not an academic discussion here in terms of, this is only happening in the bond markets and, in highfalutin, expensive hotel ballrooms where they're negotiating these things. This is playing out on the ground in Zambia, where the cost of living is getting more expensive by the day because there's just not enough capital, not enough money. Inflation is going up. It's a bad situation. And again, this is going to become political very soon for Hichilema. if he doesn't figure this out, because he's going to start attracting rivals who said, you promised us you were going to fix this and you haven't fixed it. Okay.
He has election in 2026.
26. That means he campaigns next year. He starts next year.
Exactly. 2024, it's time for him to get the economy right and to get ball rolling. Now, if he entered 2024 without the deal, without the final solution, 2025 is going to be a mess for him. It's going to be a real mess for him. I really don't know how it's going to take that with the election coming 2026.
Well, let's leave the conversation there. This is obviously a topic that we're going to pick up again. If you are interested in this topic, we have got dozens and dozens of write-ups on it on our site, dating back all the way to the beginning in November 2020, and even before that under President Edgar Lungu. No one has covered this issue more than we have on the Chinese side. Certainly Rachel is, top-notch on the whole broader situation. And the folks, by the way, over at Bloomberg are also doing a fantastic job as well. So I want to give credit to both the teams at Reuters and Bloomberg for covering this issue. But we would love for you to join the discussion that we're having over the China Global South project. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. You'll get an amazing newsletter that the team puts together every day for journalists at Reuters, for folks, at the IMF, the World Bank, the State Department, any number of different governments around the world who follow what we do every day. We would love for you to join that global reader community. Again, ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. If you are a student or a teacher, we're going to give you half off. Make it cheap. Just email me, Eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I will send you links for the 50% discount. So let's leave it there. Cobus, Geraud, and I will be back again next week with another edition of the China in Africa podcast. For Geraud Nima in Mauritius, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter @ChinaGSProject and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.